The station called Veralia Prime floated in the quiet dark of space like a shining wheel of silver and gold, turning slowly above a blue gas giant. The air inside hummed softly with the sound of life support systems and the murmur of hundreds of voices from every corner of the galaxy. Trade ships came and went. Diplomats in flowing robes moved along wide glass corridors with their guards at their sides. Mark walked among them wearing the standard black armor of the human security corps. His boots tapped steady against the polished floor as his eyes swept the crowd. Humans were still new here. Only in the last 20 years had Earth been invited into the Galactic Council. Most of the older species thought of them as bold but reckless, strong but unrefined. Their technology was behind their politics, still young by galactic standards. For that reason, human guards were often placed on the outer edges of important security teams, not trusted with the most sensitive posts. Mark knew all of this, but he kept his head high and his eyes open. His job was to stand between his charge and whatever might try to harm them today. His charge was unlike any he had guarded before. Her name was Liara, and she was a diplomat from the Serati Union, a race known for their tall, graceful build, their pale silver skin, and eyes that shifted colors like sunlight on water. They were masters of law and protocol, famous for never bending the rules, no matter the cost. She was here to mediate talks between two rival systems locked in a bitter dispute over mineral rights. The peace talks were fragile. One wrong word or one missed detail could collapse the entire meeting and lead to open war. Mark first saw her in the arrival hall. She stood surrounded by Serati aides and armored escorts, her long ceremonial coat flowing behind her as she stepped down the ramp. Every movement was precise, her voice calm and measured as she spoke to the station officials. Her eyes passed over him briefly, and he could tell she was cataloging every detail of her surroundings, but she gave no sign of interest in the human assigned to her team. He was just another body in armor, one more piece of the security wall around her. The head of station security briefed them quickly. The talks would take place over 3 days in the main council chamber. Attendance was restricted to diplomats, aides, and assigned security. Rumors had been spreading for weeks about threats to high-level delegates, especially those involved in the mineral dispute. No one had confirmed them, but the station had increased security, sweeps and doubled guard rotations. The Serati delegation had requested extra protection, and that was how Mark had been pulled into this assignment. As the group moved through the corridors toward the diplomatic quarters, Mark kept his gaze sharp. He noticed a few figures in the crowd who lingered too long watching the Serati party. He shifted slightly each time, placing himself between them and Liara. His training told him to be ready for anything, even in a place that seemed calm. The most dangerous moments often came when everyone thought they were safe. Inside the Serati quarters, the air smelled faintly of some floral scent, and the walls shimmered with patterns that changed slowly like ripples on water. Liara's aides spoke quietly as they unpacked documents and data slates. Mark took a position near the entrance, scanning each person who entered or left. She did not speak to him, but once when she passed by, she gave the smallest nod, a gesture so slight it might have been missed by anyone else. He understood it as an acknowledgement of his presence, not yet respect, but at least awareness. That night Mark patrolled the outer corridor of her quarters. The station lighting dimmed to simulate evening, but he stayed alert. The sound of distant machinery and the occasional murmur of passing crews kept him company. His thoughts wandered briefly to Earth and the people who would never see places like this, worlds that hung like jewels in the black sky. But then movement down the hall caught his attention. 2 station workers were pushing a supply cart toward him. They had the right uniforms and ID badges, but something about their pace and the way one of them kept glancing up made him step forward to block the path before he could question them. The cart jerked to the side, and one of the workers stumbled, a small cylinder slipping from under the stacked crates. Mark's hand went to his sidearm instantly, but the cylinder rolled harmlessly to the wall. The workers apologized quickly, saying it was just a power cell replacement. He let them pass but kept their faces in his memory. His instincts told him that even small things like this could matter later. The next morning, the talks began. Mark stood inside the council chamber near the main entrance. Leora sat at the center table between the two rival delegations, her voice carried softly but firmly through the hall as she laid out the first steps toward discussion. The other diplomats listened, some nodding, some frowning. The chamber's walls were high and lined with banners from dozens of worlds. Security staff from many species stood at the edges, watching for trouble. Mark's eyes kept moving, scanning every seat, every movement in the crowd. He had worked enough assignments to know that danger could come from the unlikeliest places. The Serati believed deeply in the shield of law and custom, but he had learned that not everyone in the galaxy played by the same rules. And if the rumors were true, someone here might be ready to test how far those rules could be bent or broken. Leora spoke with a calm precision that seemed unshakable. She referenced treaties, dates, and shared histories, weaving her words like threads in a net meant to hold the two angry factions in place for at least long enough to find common ground. Watching her work, Mark realized that her discipline was a kind of armor too, not made of metal, but of conviction. Yet no armor was perfect, and his job was to be there when hers was tested. As the first session ended, the delegations filed out under the watchful eyes of their guards. Leora passed close to Mark again, and this time she looked at him for a heartbeat longer than before. Her gaze was unreadable, but he thought he saw the faintest flicker of curiosity, perhaps even a question unspoken. Then she was gone down the corridor, surrounded by her aides. Mark stayed behind, letting the crowd thin before he followed. His mind stayed on that moment, unsure why it mattered, but certain that, in the days to come, every small detail could mean everything. The second day of the peace talks began under the pale light of Veralia Prime's simulated dawn. The station's outer panels caught the glow of the nearby star and spread it through the great glass corridors so that every surface seemed to shine. Mark was already on his feet long before the delegates began to stir. He moved through the corridors with quiet steps, checking every checkpoint in the route between the Serati quarters and the council chamber. Each guard in his path gave a nod, and he returned it without slowing. His mind was already locked into the rhythm of his task. See everything, trust nothing, act before it is too late. Inside the chamber, preparations were underway. The banners of the rival factions hung on opposite sides of the high walls, and the center table gleamed under the soft white lights. Leora stood at her place, reviewing notes with one of her aides, her voice steady and low. Mark positioned himself near the primary entrance so he could watch the entire sweep of the room. From here he had a clear view of the delegates, the observers, and the service staff, who moved quietly in the background, carrying trays of water and documents. His gaze lingered a second longer on a group of station maintenance crew, adjusting a light fixture near the upper gallery. Something about the timing of their work during such an important meeting made him store the detail in the back of his mind. Talks began and tension quickly filled the air. The two rival representatives spoke in careful, measured tones, but the weight behind their words was clear. Each accusation and counterpoint was wrapped in polite language, but the threat beneath was sharp as a blade. Leora listened without showing any sign of frustration, her hands folded on the table, her silver gaze shifting from one speaker to the other. When she spoke, her words were balanced and deliberate, urging cooperation, pointing to the long-term benefits of peace. Mark admired the way she controlled the room with nothing more than her voice, but his attention never stayed fixed on her for long. His duty was to catch the things others missed, the subtle movements, the restless glances, the unnatural stillness that often came just before violence had happened. During the mid-session recess, delegates rose from their seats and moved toward the refreshment tables along the wall. Leora remained at the table reviewing a datapad while her aides whispered behind her. Mark scanned the crowd, noting who approached and who left. Then out of the corner of his eye he caught a shift in the upper gallery. The same maintenance crew from earlier was still there, but one of them was no longer working on the fixture. His hands moved in a way that was too deliberate, too precise for ordinary. Repair work. Mark's focus narrowed. He stepped forward into the chamber without waiting for confirmation. A small glint caught the light in the worker's hands. A compact weapon unfolding from what had looked like a harmless tool. Mark's training took over in a burst of movement. He closed the distance between himself and Leora. Her head turned slightly in surprise as he reached her chair, and in that same instant, the weapon fired a thin line of burning plasma shot through the air, aimed straight for her chest. Mark's body slammed into hers, pushing her hard against the table. He felt the heat tear across his side. Then the shock of pain as the blast burned through his armor. The chamber erupted in chaos. Shouts rose from every direction. Guards from multiple delegations drew their weapons. Station alarms blared in warning. The maintenance worker dropped his weapon and tried to flee, but was tackled by 2 station security officers. Mark barely registered it. His only thought was to keep Leora low behind the table until he was sure the threat was gone. She was speaking to him, now her voice urgent, but his ears were ringing from the concussive hum of the plasma blast. He felt his knees weaken as the pain in his side grew sharper. Wet warmth spreading beneath the armor where the energy had cut into him. Other guards rushed in, creating a tight wall around the Serati diplomat. One of them tried to pull her away, but she resisted, still keeping her gaze locked on Mark. He saw something in her eyes now that had not been there before, a flash of disbelief, followed by something closer to concern. She spoke quickly in her own language to her aides, and they moved aside, clearing the way for 2 station medics to kneel beside him. Their hands worked fast, sealing the wound with temporary field gel, but the pain was still there, deep and unrelenting. As they lifted him onto a stretcher, Mark caught fragments of what was happening around him. The assassin was being dragged away, shouting in a language he did not understand. Station security sealed the chamber and began questioning every crew member. Inside, delegates huddled in tense groups, speaking in urgent tones. Leora stood apart from them, her tall frame rigid, her gaze following the stretcher as it moved toward the exit. She looked as if she wanted to speak to him, but the press of guards kept her in place. The last thing he saw before the medics turned the corner was her hand lifting slightly, a gesture almost like a reach, before she let it fall to her side. The ride to the medbay blurred into flashes of light and shadow. Mark's vision swam, but he stayed conscious, focusing on the steady rhythm of the medics' voices calling out his condition. The scent of antiseptic filled the air as they pushed through the sliding doors and into the bright, sterile space. The hiss of equipment and the beeping of monitors surrounded him as more hands worked to remove the damaged armor and start deeper treatment in the corridor outside. Leora's aides argued with station officials, demanding update. Station policy was clear: diplomats were to remain in secure quarters during any incident and were not permitted to interfere with medical procedures. But somewhere between the orders and the shouting, a decision was being made, one that would set in motion events neither Mark nor Leora could yet see coming. She had watched him step into the path of death without hesitation, and in that moment, something in her view of him and of his people had shifted. The rules she had lived by all her life suddenly seemed less uncheckable. And somewhere deep inside, she felt the first stirrings of a choice that could cost her everything. The medbay lights shone too bright against the pale walls, and the steady hum of machines filled the air like a low pulse. Mark lay on a narrow bed, surrounded by alien and human medics working in precise movements. Their voices stayed calm, but he caught the edge of urgency beneath the words. They were trying to stabilize the wound, keep his breathing even, and stop the bleeding from going deeper into muscle and bone. The smell of antiseptic mixed with a faint metallic taste in his mouth, and his vision blurred at the edges. Every time he tried to lift his head, a wave of dizziness pushed him back down outside the secured glass doors. 2 station guards stood motionless, watching for anyone who might try to enter without clearance. Leora stood there with her aides at her side, speaking in the measured tone of someone used to giving orders, but the tension in her eyes betrayed her calm. She had been told in no uncertain terms that diplomats must not interfere in medical matters, and that her presence here was unnecessary. She had been advised to return to her quarters and resume preparations for the next negotiation session. But she had not moved. Her mind was still replaying the moment in the council chamber. The sound of the weapon discharging the sudden force as Mark's body slammed into hers, the heat of the blast passing close enough to scorch the edge of her coat, and then the sight of him falling with the wound burning through his armor. The Serati Code demanded distance between diplomats and security personnel. Their role was to serve and protect without expectation of personal involvement. Theirs was to remain impartial, never crossing the lines of command or attachment. But the image of him bleeding for her had settled in her thoughts like a weight she could not ignore. She turned to one of her aides, speaking in their own language, instructing them to contact the Serati medical envoy stationed on a nearby cruiser. The aide hesitated, reminding her that doing so would require an override of station authority. She knew the rules. She also knew that the healing capabilities of her people were far beyond what the station medbay could offer, and that the chances of his recovery would rise sharply if Serati technology was applied early. She gave the order again, sharper this time, and the aide moved away to make the call. The guards at the door straightened when she stepped forward. The taller one raised a hand, politely asking her to remain outside. Leora's gaze fixed on him with the same intensity she used in high-level negotiations. She told him that the human inside had saved her life and that she was invoking her right as an active diplomatic participant in a security incident to oversee the care of her. Protect her. The guard repeated the regulation that only medical staff could enter. She replied that she had already summoned her own medical team and that they would arrive within minutes, and if the station attempted to block them, she would bring the matter before the Galactic Council with full evidence of the station's refusal to protect the life of a council guard. It was not entirely true that she had such immediate legal standing, but her voice carried the weight of someone who believed in the power of her own words. The guard hesitated, then stepped aside, letting her through. The glass doors slid open, and the sound of the medic's work grew louder. She walked to the side of the bed and for the first time saw the wound without the armor. It was a deep, angry burn, edged with charred fabric and faint wisps of smoke, still rising from the cauterized skin. Mark's breathing was shallow, his eyes half closed, but when he noticed her presence, they flickered with faint surprise. He tried to speak, but she told him not to waste his strength. Her tone was not soft, but there was an undercurrent of something unspoken, a current she was not used to letting others hear. The lead medic started to protest, saying her presence would distract the team. She cut him off with a firm statement that they would continue until the Serati specialists arrived, and that any refusal to cooperate would be noted in the official diplomatic record. The medic glanced at the station guard at the door, and then nodded reluctantly, continuing his work. Minutes later, the medbay doors opened again, and 3 Serati healers entered, carrying sleek cases of equipment that shimmered with pale blue light. Their movements were precise and almost silent. They began setting up a series of devices around the bed, scanning the wound and feeding data into a holographic display. One of them looked at Leora and gave a small tilt of the head, indicating that with their methods the damage could be reversed far more quickly than with standard treatment. She told them to proceed without delay. Mark felt a cool sensation spread through his side as one of the devices projected a thin layer of energy directly into the wound, knitting the damaged tissue at a speed that seemed impossible. The pain dulled into a deep ache, and his vision cleared enough for him to see her standing there, watching closely. He wanted to ask why she was doing this, why she was risking what he guessed must be a serious breach of her own rules. But her expression told him the question was not needed now. The answer was written in the simple fact that she was there. Outside the medbay, the station's political channels were already buzzing. News of her intervention was spreading among the delegations. Some saw it as a sign of deep respect for the human guard. Others saw it as a dangerous compromise of Serati neutrality by the time the healing procedure ended and Mark was moved to a recovery room. Leora's actions had been reported to her own government. The messages that arrived for her were sharp with warning. The council back home demanded an explanation and hinted that her position might be reviewed. She read the messages in silence, then closed the communicator without responding. For now her focus was only on the man in the bed and the knowledge that without her decision, he might already be gone. She had broken a line she had sworn never to cross, and she knew there would be a price to pay. But she also knew that the rules had been written in a world that did not account for this moment, for a choice made in the shadow of a plasma blast. When the simplest truth was that one life had been traded for another, and she could not stand by without returning that debt. Mark woke to the soft hum of the recovery room systems. The air smelled faintly of clean metal and the faint floral trace left behind by the Serati healers. His side still ached, but the pain was different now, dulled and fading beneath the strange warmth of the alien medical treatment. He lay still for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the dim lighting. Then he noticed the tall figure seated near the foot of his bed. Leora sat perfectly upright, her hands resting lightly on her knees. Her gaze was fixed on him, though her expression remained controlled. He tried to speak, but his throat felt dry. She rose, without hesitation, poured water from a silver carafe, and handed it to him. The gesture was simple, yet entirely out of place for someone of her rank. She waited until he drank before speaking. Her voice carried its usual calm, yet beneath it was something heavier. She told him the healing had been successful, and that he would recover fully in a few days. She did not mention the storm that had been gathering beyond the medbay walls, but Mark could sense it in the tightness of her tone while he had. Then unconscious messages had poured in from the Serati Union and from the Galactic Council. Some praised her quick action in securing advanced treatment for her protector. Others condemned it as a reckless breach of protocol that risked compromising her impartiality in the peace talks. The rules were clear. A diplomat was never to interfere directly in the care of security personnel, especially by bringing in foreign medical teams without station clearance. She had ignored those rules, and now her rivals were moving to use that choice against her. Mark listened in silence as she explained the situation. He could see that she had already accepted the consequences, and that she did not regret her decision. She told him that political factions opposed to the peace talks were using the attack as proof that the negotiations were unsafe and should be abandoned. Rival delegations were demanding tighter restrictions on security movements, and in some cases calling for the talks to be relocated entirely. The momentum she had worked so hard to build over the last 2 days was beginning to fracture. Asked about the attacker, the maintenance worker who had fired the shot, she told him that under interrogation, the man had claimed to be acting alone, but station security had found encrypted messages linking him to a shadow group from one of the rival systems. The group's goal was to disrupt the talks entirely and push the factions into open conflict. The assassination attempt on her had been meant to shatter trust between the parties, and the fact that a human guard had been wounded in her place was now a point of heated debate among the delegates. Some argued that it was proof of human bravery. Others said it was evidence that the council's security protocols were flawed. Mark shifted uncomfortably in the bed, wanting to stand and return to duty, but she told him firmly to stay seated. The healers had instructed him to rest, and she would not allow him to ignore that order. Still, he could not help feeling that lying here while the talks teetered on the edge of collapse was wrong. He told her he could be ready within hours if needed. She looked at him for a long moment before saying that she might hold him to that sooner than either of them expected. Later that day she left the medbay to face the council chamber again. The air inside was thick with mistrust. Delegates whispered in small circles, their voices sharp with accusation. The leaders of the rival factions eyed one another with open suspicion. Leora took her seat at the center table, ignoring the cold glances directed her way. The head of the station security gave a brief report confirming the attacker's connection to the shadow group, and urging the talks to continue under heightened protection. Leora then rose and addressed the room directly. Her speech was calm but carried the unmistakable edge of command. She spoke of the attack, not as a sign of weakness but as proof of the stakes involved. She described the actions of her human guard without embellishment, yet her words made clear that his choice to protect her at the cost of his own safety was the kind of courage the galaxy could not afford to lose. She challenged the delegates to show the same resolve in choosing peace over the easier path of war. Her gaze moved across the room, lingering on each representative until they shifted uncomfortably under the weight of her stare. Meanwhile, in the medbay, Mark was visited by one of the station intelligence officers, a human woman with a quiet voice and sharp eyes. She asked him to recount everything he had seen before the attack, every detail about the maintenance crew, every movement he had noticed. He told her about the strange timing of their work and the way one of them had kept glancing at the chamber. She listened carefully, taking notes, and then revealed that there might have been more than one operative inside the chamber. During the attack, she asked if he could identify faces from the crowd, and he agreed that evening. Leora returned to the medbay, bringing with her a datapad full of intercepted communications. The station intelligence team had uncovered a plan for a second strike set to occur before the talks concluded. This time the target would not be her, but one of the rival leaders. If that happened, the blame would likely be placed on the other faction, and any chance of peace would be destroyed. She told Mark that the council had ordered her to remain in secure quarters until the talks ended, but she had no intention of hiding while another attempt was made. She wanted him at her side when they exposed the conspiracy. Mark swung his legs off the bed, ignoring the ache in his side. He told her he was ready. She did not argue, though he could see the faint trace of concern in her eyes. Together they reviewed the plan. The intelligence team would quietly monitor all movement into the council chamber and the surrounding corridors. Mark would blend in with a group of station guards to avoid drawing attention. Leora would proceed with the talks as normal, but would signal him if she saw anything unusual. It was a dangerous plan that put both of them in the path of another possible attack, but neither hesitated. In the quiet that followed their preparations, Mark realized that the bond between them had shifted again. It was no longer only the protector and the protected. They were now allies in a fight that reached beyond their assigned roles. The rules she had lived by had already been broken once, and now she seemed ready to break them again, if it meant stopping those who would destroy the fragile peace. He understood that whatever came next would decide not just the outcome of the talks, but also the place of humans like him in the eyes of the galaxy. The final day of the peace talks arrived with the air in Veralia, prime heavy with expectation. Outside the great glass walls of the station, the gas giant turned slowly, casting shifting bands of blue and green light across the corridors inside the council chamber. Every delegate sat straighter than before, voices hushed, eyes sharper. Station security was doubled at every entrance, and small surveillance drones hovered silently near the ceiling. Mark stood among the guards near the rear. His armor polished, his side still aching faintly beneath it, but his mind focused completely on the task ahead. Leora sat at the center table, flanked by aides, her posture as unshakable as ever, though Mark could read the small tension in her shoulders. Session began with cautious exchanges between the rival factions. Each word seemed measured against the weight of possible failure. The documents for the first stage of agreement lay on the table between them, but no one had yet reached for the pen. Leora spoke steadily, reminding them of the progress they had already made and the costs of turning away now. Her voice was calm, yet carried an undertone of steel. She had survived an attack in this very room and still sat here urging peace. The effect was not lost on the delegates. Mark's eyes moved constantly over the chamber, scanning the crowd, the entrances, and the staff moving between them. He remembered the intelligence briefing. The second strike could come from anyone: a disguised attendant, a messenger, even another member of the security detail. He kept one hand close to his weapon and watched for the smallest break in the flow of movement. His gaze lingered on a pair of servers bringing in trays of refreshments. Their pace was steady, but one of them avoided eye contact with the guards. The memory of the first attacker flashed in his mind, and he began to move slowly along the edge of the room toward them. As he closed the distance, he caught a faint metallic glint at the server's wrist, a device no standard server would wear. He quickened his steps. The figure noticed and shifted the tray slightly. Mark's voice cut through the low murmur of the chamber, telling them to stop. The figure reacted, instantly dropping the tray and reaching under it. A concealed weapon slid into their hand, but before it could be raised, Mark lunged, driving his shoulder into the attacker's chest. The weapon clattered to the floor, and the other guard rushed in to restrain them. The chamber erupted in startled voices. Leora rose from her seat, eyes locked on Mark, as he stood over the captured assailant, breathing hard. The device on the attacker's wrist was quickly removed and scanned, revealing encrypted orders to assassinate one of the faction leaders and frame the other. The proof was undeniable. Station security moved fast to secure the room and escort the delegates to safety. Leora remained standing at the center table, demanding that everyone stay to hear the truth. She spoke over the noise, explaining the conspiracy in clear, unshaken words. The attempt had failed because of the vigilance of her human guard, and because the council had chosen to act together. Rather than retreat in fear, she turned toward the two rival leaders and told them plainly that if they let the work of these days fall apart, now they would be handing victory to those who thrived on chaos. The leaders exchanged glances, and after a tense pause, both stepped forward to sign the first stage agreement. The sound of the signatures scratching against the document was almost lost beneath the quiet rush of breath that passed through the chamber. Security officers relaxed slightly, but Mark did not lower his guard until the attackers were gone and the delegates were escorted to private rooms to finalize the details. Leora approached him, her eyes steady and her tone measured, but softer than usual. She told him he had done more than protect her. He had safeguarded the possibility of peace for two worlds. Later that day, in the quiet of the Sarati quarters, Leora received the official message from her government. The peace agreement had been acknowledged as a success, but her personal conduct had been judged in violation of diplomatic code. She would be reassigned to a less critical post far from the Central Council. Her response was short, a simple acknowledgement of the decision. She closed the message and for a moment let the weight of it settle before standing to prepare for departure. Mark visited her before she left. The room felt strangely empty without the bustle of aides and guards. She was dressed in the plain travel coat of her people, not the formal attire of a negotiator. Her voice was calm when she spoke, thanking him for his service and his courage. She told him that positions and titles could be taken away, but some choices could not be undone and should not be regretted. He asked if she would have done the same had it been another guard in his place. She looked at him for a long moment before saying that perhaps she would have, but perhaps not in quite the same way. They walked together to the docking bay. The corridors seemed quieter now, though the station still hummed with life. At the bay doors, she stopped, turning to face him fully. Her gaze held his, and though her expression remained composed, he could sense the unspoken things in the silence between them. Respect, trust, a bond forged in fire and choice. She told him to keep walking the path he had chosen because the galaxy remembered acts like his long after the names of politicians faded. Then she stepped onto the transport ramp without looking back. Mark watched until the ship slipped away into the dark, leaving only the faint shimmer of its drive in the distance. He turned and walked back into the station, feeling the weight of the armor on his shoulders and the steady pull of duty waiting ahead. Word of what had happened in the council chamber was already spreading among the crews and traders. A few nodded to him as he passed, and he knew that the story would travel far, that somewhere beyond the stars, the name of one human guard would be remembered alongside that of an alien diplomat who had broken the rules for him. The peace between the two factions would not erase all their differences, but it had been one without war, and for Mark that was enough. For Leora, it would be the beginning of a different path, one without the power of her old position, but perhaps with a clearer view of what truly mattered. And for the galaxy, it was another reminder that sometimes the most important line crossed was the one that separated duty from choice, and that courage was not bound by species or protocol. End.